Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Adelle Lin. This is my first time in Toronto, and my first time on a FITC stage, so thank you so much for having me here. I'm super excited. So, I love the web. Who here loves the web? Show of hands? Yep, the whole room. Right, so everybody here loves the web. Now, why is that? It's a very rich environment. It's a place full of wonder and excitement. It's somewhere you can experience on your own. It's somewhere you can experience with 1,000 of your closest friends. It can be a very serious place, but it can also be full of whimsy. However, there is one thing that the web currently lacks: space. More specifically, Z-space or the third dimension. So all of these rich experiences are flattened, and how we come to it tends to be kind of a very linear journey. Each page is a journey which comes to you just kind of one by one. Although it's full of possibilities, every time you make a choice, you're kind of stepping away from your original position. You kind of lose sight of where you came from, oftentimes. But this is not, in fact, how you experience the world. You're, often sitting in a room, you're reading a newspaper, you're typing notes into your laptop, you're receiving messages on your phone. Sorry, is that? And sometimes even watching TV in the background. We move from task to task, often from space to space, from screen space to physical space. We experience light, texture, sound all at once. And this is kind of what I want to discuss today. What if the physicality of all this is fused with the digital world that we've all come to make our home, which we call the web? So hello again. I'm a creative technologist, a developer, a maker. I'm trained in architecture and design, and generally a person with Renaissance leanings. Currently, I'm working within an innovation team at Intel and completing a Master's of Science at NYU School of Engineering. I'm also a member of the NYC Resistor Hackerspace, a space which I consider my home, second home, third home, in Code Liberation, whose mission is to bring technology and creative endeavors to women of all ages, and it's something I'm really proud to be of. I'm sorry. Sorry, test. Is that, yeah? Okay, so my work centers around the understanding of human relationships, relationships with yourself, with each other, and also the space around you. So last year, my team and I put biosensors on models, and we projected their biorhythms on runways at Paris Fashion Week. We also created wireless musical instruments, allowing musicians and dancers to play keyboards, string instruments, and percussions with just their movements. Now, I've taken this invisible relationship into VR and tried to reimagine how data coming from your body can activate stuff in virtual space. However, as a note, I'm not here speaking on behalf of Intel and their work, but rather this is part of a larger body of my research, which feeds into it, as well as stuff that I'm exploring in my master's. I started thinking about UX design and space during my career in architecture at a firm called Card Productions, where we used techniques of body storming and experience paths to design commercial spaces. Here we built an entire bank branch out of cardboard boxes and had the employees train and go through day-to-day roles before the branch even opened. Now, this is a technique that I found that the McDonald's brothers have also used when developing their first streamlined kitchen. I also love creating interactive experiences that connect people. Here's an installation project I built with the HTC Vive this summer with my creative partner, Matt Pinner. It's for a lovely new games expo called Play NYC. We gave players nets and put them in the middle of a meteor shower and gave them the ability to catch stars. It was called Starcatcher VR. So you can actually play this in the material world as well as in virtual reality, depending on the context. It was actually a pretty amazing way to learn about the human condition. I've also worked on projects with Come Out and Play. They are a group that make big games and basically invite the public once a year to come, in thousands to play games, either in small groups or in large groups. For Night Games, I made a mystery game which was called Who's That Loft, where players were given perspective images and maps and hunted for clues with invisible ink. Here at Times Square, I made a picnic ground where visitors were encouraged to sit down and explore this iconic neighborhood in a different perspective. They could also communicate with strangers via mushroom sound stations that were connected wirelessly. So as you can see, a lot of my practice draws upon game design theories and mechanics, as it is inherently interactive in nature. So with a body of work that continuously traverses between real and virtual environments, I began to be very interested in the term mixed reality. So this term was introduced initially by Paul Milgram in the 90s. He was actually from the University of Toronto. So this concept describes mixed reality as it encompasses everything in between the real environment and the virtual environment. So you have the virtual augmenting reality, called augmented reality, and reality augmenting virtual environments, augmented virtuality. Microsoft HoloLens's mixed reality is augmented reality with context and spatial awareness. And you also have companies that are making these green screen boxes where they describe mixed reality as overlaying, the real person into the digital world. So to be precise, you have VR, AR, and MR. Now these are poised to be really, really big industries with large amounts of capital being poured in every day. Who here is currently developing in one of these? Cool, small number of hands. So, you will know that things here are really, really messy. As a developer, you need to be familiar not just with the hardware, but development platforms, APIs, and which marketplace you need to place your product onto. It can kind of be paralyzing if you're starting. And with the recent release of ARKit, AR Core, WebVR, you can almost be developing on any platform, but then you have to pick which language you want to be working in. So it's pretty tricky. And also, let's not forget the interactions. Another major factor of thinking about how do you want your user to interact with the content. Are they going to be using a camera to recognize gestures? Are they going to have clickers or different kinds of controllers, IMU-based type things? As I was at the WebVR talk just a little bit ago. Kevin Vandegaard talked about WebVR, and he described it as a moving platform and probably something that's going to be moving for the next 5 years. So, for me, when kind of faced with this, it was important to be able to work across a lot of platforms and all realities. And so, I kind of like to use Unity as my main development platform. I've built some projects for AR and mobile, mixed reality on the HoloLens, and a bit of VR in the Daydream and HTC Vive. So when I explore technology, I usually do it through an artistic concept, and this way I feel free to explore the technology for what it can provide and what it can enhance, as opposed to trying to fit the technology to a commercial purpose. So one of my early projects that I built in augmented reality is called Lisa. And so I made these jewelry pieces kind of out of laser-cut plastic. that could be tracked by a camera. And what it does is it would give the wearer an augmented body in the form of wings and other. And so the idea was that this could be customized to each individual person, either for themselves or as a gift. And every time you wear it, you could kind of feel an invisible strength. And you could see that through the lens of a camera. I also worked on a research project last year on whether wearables such as a ring could be an intuitive input into controlling virtual content on a head-worn device. So what sort of gestures would provide good inputs. So this content is captured via the HoloLens, and I kind of have my hand up straight in front just so that could be captured, but you don't necessarily need to be doing the gestures straight up. So what I learned from this study is that 3 to 4 gestures is about the maximum a person can remember. And so it's important to pick what are the functions you want these gestures to be able to get users to do. And also whether the gesture was intuitive kind of depended on the digital platform that the users are currently relating to. So depending on whether they would relate a gesture more to using their phone or a mouse or their key presses, they would intuitively move towards different gestures. I had one participant who just sort of had this idea that she was calling messages to come to her, so she kept doing this, like, come. So, there's all these different things, and different cultures kind of use their hands very differently. So, there's just like so much interesting work, I think, in this space. So now I'd like to move into the main sort of content of my talk, where I'll outline a case study project that I developed for mixed reality, and delve into some metaphor studies, as well as some use cases that came out of it. And then I'll go through a mixed reality UX framework that should help with starting and also evaluating your project. So this summer we were introduced to WebVR, and suddenly I was hearing the questions of how do you experience the web? Once upon a time, everyone was rushing just to be able to have a web presence for their business. Then it became a social media presence. And now, it's some sort of 3D digital presence. But, in the context of a business, I think where it gets really tricky is deciding on how you want to deliver your content. I think it's very important to be contextually aware here. What purpose is the virtual content going to provide for your customer? Is it better to have a fully immersive portal, or parts that just augment your customer's life? So for example, if you're a travel company, you might want to have a range of offerings where you would want to offer virtual tours of places people could visit when they're at home. But once they've got to their destination, you might want to have an augmented reality tool that shows them some wayfinding pathways and maybe restaurants that they should visit. And so those would be kind of more location-based, so you'd want to have be able to mix that up. Of course, if you're IKEA, then context-specific augmented reality would make sense right off the bat. And how I came to prototype some of these technologies in terms of the web began at the start of the year. The Microsoft creative team and NYU developed a brief asking us to develop an artist portfolio for the HoloLens. I worked with a small group of graduate students and 2 New York artists, Tony Dove and Tom Shannon, to create an app called More. This project was great because immediately things that you take for granted in web design suddenly become really complicated. For example, what is the navigation bar? How are people going to interact with it? How do people move from one page to another? What form should the art exist in? Should people be able to interact with it? And if so, how? We're currently still in the process of deciding whether to use flat design or not, material design. But what happens in these 3D mixed realities? So since this was a project very much centered around, we chose to center this project around physicality and tactility, because this was a chance to explore, room scale design. I was very interested in pushing the physicality of what we would consider the web. So drawing from, artist studio visits, where you would have the artworks generally placed around the room, and then, the artist's desk, and maybe some of their tools. And this is where you would go to gather any additional information. So if the artist wanted to show you some process works, they would go to their laptop and, show you a video, or they would go to a drawer and pull out a tool, or, maybe something they just hacked together. And so I wanted the navigation bar to be a collection of objects that people could observe, pick up, look at. And we wanted the artist to be able to show off their works and, maybe curate it, because this was meant for curators to be able to look at the works if they couldn't visit the studio in person. We also used voice prompts when users entered each space to cue interactions. So this is an example of walking into one of the rooms, and the capture on the HoloLens is a little tricky, but so this is what we would call an activation zone. So basically, you would have the lights off until you walked into a space and came to engage with a painting. And, an object, this cylinder would appear, which is part of the artist's process and how he does his paintings. And so this was to encourage the users to do what they're already familiar with, walk around and look at art. And so we use cues of lighting and delineating of, whether a space is an activation zone or not. Also, to exit this room, there's an archway behind you where you could physically just walk out of it. We also wanted to explore the materiality of objects. So you can see right at the start, we're scanning an image so that would transport you into each different artist's spot. So a lot of this was, really quick development and prototyping, so, it's not really perfect. But, this was... so here are some of the features that I just discussed. So being able to send out objects or images or samples of materials to curators so that they can use that to scan into an artist's room, using this notion of the artist's desk as a hub for information, moving around the space, et cetera, et cetera. So these problems we're trying to solve only begin to scratch the surface and really start delving into early skeuomorphism. Traditionally, this is where graphical interfaces emulate the aesthetics of physical objects. So such as when Apple started designing icons for their interface, the objects began as symbols for activities that the low-level computer were performing. However, soon they became activities themselves that now have their own metaphorical meanings. One other obvious example is the term Googling. In his book, Visual Intelligence, Daniel Hoffman describes how we come to understand understand virtual experiences, both through our phenomenal brain and our relational brain. Our phenomenal brain creates our constructed experience. So this is where shape, color, motion, and depth and touch are developed. But it is our relational brain that tells us what the interaction we're having with the constructed object. So in this sense, the phenomenal brain is a graphical interface for the relational brain. And all that's required of a graphical interface really is that it be systematically related to what it represents. This interface can be as arbitrary as we like, as long as we're able to relate to the underlying activity. So in the situation of erasing a file from disk, we can drag the graphical element of a file into a graphical representation of a trash can. We can press the command delete key, or go into the command line and type rm-r. Maybe in mixed reality, we could call upon our vacuum cleaner anime friend and, perform the activities of throwing trash. And so this is where the line starts to blur between mimetic skeuomorphs, which is the most difficult word to say a few times today, which alludes to the ritual of human heuristics and heuristic motifs. So these are pretty easy examples and things that we're familiar with. But what happens when we start to conflate metaphors from the real world and the digital world? So such things as reading screens in VR. Google has been thinking really hard about this. They've introduced this unit called the DIMS, which is distant independent millimeters. And this is a way where you can kind of fix the size of things and scale them up accordingly across various distances. And this is fine for now. We are mostly still transferring our screen content directly into the virtual world. And, but you do get kind of hilarious examples like this. This is High Fidelity, which is from the creators of Second Life. It's kind of a marketplace for VR content, but they also want you to be able to directly interact with the web. So right now, how you come to it is once you get into the world, you have an iPad, and then you browse the iPad for content with this little stick thing, and you scroll, and then you select content, and so it's kind of this multiple screen within screens. That's pretty fun. So typing in VR is another interesting case. Google claims that using controllers like sticks on a xylophone is pretty intuitive, much more intuitive than regular typing. It's up there. And Leap Motion has been doing this for a few years, getting us to use the Leap Motion as keyboards. But so here's kind of a little bit of a list of metaphors to start considering for your, when you are thinking about an app or porting your website into VR. And you really want to think about which signifies, what you're going to use and how your users are going to come to the content. I really enjoy Rick and Morty, so I've been playing a bit of their VR game, and so you're going to see a few snippets from there. So it's really intuitive, like how I was wondering how you were going to be able to interact with all these objects. And so you have your two controllers, and generally when you get close to the thing that you can interact with, it highlights blue. And so you know that you can interact with it, and things kind of snap on and off pretty easily. But that's a good way to signify how to open objects and things that you normally would do with two hands. And there are certain times where you have to pick up things and pass them to yourself, and they have this little creature, Mr. Meeseeks, if you watch the series, and he kind of is your mirror, and so you get him to do things for you, and you do these things back and forth. So it's kind of interesting ways and maybe some things that are a little bit more fun that you can introduce to your users. So I think it's important to think about the information journey. There's a lot of research done about the information journey for users and how users seek information on the web. So Designing the Search Experience by Tony Russell, Rose, and Tyler Tate outlines a few models. One particular model developed by Anne Blanford and Simon Atfield frames the information journey as recognizing the need for information, then you go and acquire the information. Number 3, you interpret and validate the information, and then you use the information. So, let's start looking at number 2. So there are many ways for users to acquire information these days. You have your Google, your smart agents such as Siri, Cortana, algorithm-based recommendations on Netflix, Spotify. Then there's crowdsourced information such as Quora. Then you have your social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, location-based such as Yelp, and then there's just plain old surfing. And that's the last one I'm kind of interested in looking at. So specifically, we look at browsing, surfing, and clicking through hyperlinks, which is also called foraging. Peter Pirelli and Stuart Card, researchers at the Palo Alto Research Center Park in the 90s, drew a connection between users moving from website to website and animals traveling from patch to patch. So users rely on cues on which they would call information sense to guide them along this journey. So people, I believe, who are good Googlers, describe the way they start with a term and then they kind of find better terms and sense, to keep on searching. So, again, in designing the search experience, novices at searchers are described as people slow to scout the territory. They stay close to home base, and they often wander back to their original search terms, whereas expert searchers are akin to teleporting. They are very precise, and they know kind of like what destinations they want to get to, and it could be very far from where they started from. So those with high domain and technical expertise often take a depth-first approach to try to get to their destinations directly. Now, these are inherently very physical metaphors and have very spatial connotations in the way that the mind maps information. With virtual immersive realities, we potentially are able to map out these spaces, to map out the relationships we have between information, kind of in a spatial kind of way, and maybe think about how you would move back and forth between these spaces. People kind of tend to remember searches by retracing steps. Again, very similar to, looking for your keys, or, where you left your wallet or something. So, kind of thinking about the way people remember things spatially can actually help you map things out informationally, for example. So games use foraging as a mechanic for gameplay very often. And now with better real-time graphics, games begin to use these spatial metaphors within their menu systems even. So Splatoon 2 here has their players walk around this main square. They call it Inkopolis Square. Inkopolis, yeah. In order to choose between different game modes and shops and, kind of coming in and out of different worlds. One of the best things I loved about, Pokemon Go is, finding new and hidden art that I didn't even know was art in my neighborhood. And also you kind of develop this new relationship with your local, because it's now also a Pokespot, and it's also where you go to fight friends, and, you can spend hours there collecting things, and, it kind of makes you think about the space you're in very different ways. I remember, I think in the first week I was at Union Square, and there was just so many people playing the game, and suddenly we all had this new language to talk to each other with. It was pretty cool. So another concept I wanted to talk about is sensemaking. Sensemaking explains how new information seekers go about foraging for information, extracting relevant concepts and encoding information while gaining insights. This relates to number 3 in the information journey, interpreting and validating information. Stephen Denig outlines 3 sensory modalities relevant to learning: verbal, visual, and kinesthetic. And out of the 3, kinesthetic learners are the most handicapped in terms of how content is delivered to them currently. Whereas I think, in VR, you could actually help these learners a lot quicker and, kind of have a new audience for your tools. Again, games kind of have you working on these mindless tasks, solving puzzles, but in being able to do these things repetitively, you have a better access to remembering them. And, this is how you charge a battery in Rick and Morty. So the last thing in the information journey is about using the information. And one of the cases that I'm particularly interested in is reuse of information. More specifically, how do I store this information for future use? I'm constantly trying out different bookmarking tools. I migrated to Pockets when Delicious disappeared. I'm trying out Toby. This smell-based system seems kind of cool. But generally this is me. I'm kind of tend to have I like my everything I need cable wall kind of gal, as opposed to kind of everything organized or disorganized in a drawer. So what happens when you try to organize information in 3D virtual space? Yep, things can get messy. Stacks and rows and columns. So more importantly, if people remember by time, by color, by shape, by sound, what is the right form that data should have? Is it stacks of text? Is it hyperlinks? Is it balls, drawers? Have to start thinking about relationships for, people of different learning abilities, different cultural backgrounds. So luckily, there are already metaphors for this. Piroli and Card observed 3 common practices used by intelligence analysts to conduct large-scale sense-making, which they term the shoebox: evidence file and schema. The shoebox being a place for initial dumping ground, anything that relates to a topic. The evidence file, a place where where key information is gathered, and the schema is constructed with more context around the relational brain. So search-based sites like Amazon do this well, where you have a cart, you can just like throw everything in, and then when it comes to checkout time, you can still move stuff out as save for later, so that being your shoebox. So, again, what if we conflate these metaphors with realistic concepts of the shoebox and the evidence file? A lot can be learned from how people design spaces. For example, the golden triangle in the kitchen has proven to work, across all of its various iterations. The first fitted kitchen was developed by a woman called Margaret Lihotzky as a housewife laboratory, and her goal was to maximize comfort and also efficiency and equipment for the worker. Again, many ideas from lab space design for organization, ergonomics, and kind of relates to how we would potentially store information in our digital workplace. So in summary, think about the metaphors and spaces that make sense for your application. Yeah, so in designing this mixed reality space can be complicated. And how do you know you're on the right track before you go too far? So in developing more, we also developed a design framework for mixed reality. This is based on some earlier research I had around game design frameworks for installations. This framework is intended to take into account limiting factors of a project, such as your resources, your cognitive load, and also the added complexity of physical metaphors to help guide designers and developers in determining the UX complexity required for the project. So there are 4 key forces that can be considered when building a project. So the relational context, the system design, the environment design, and how that then influences the UX forces in the experience. The overarching force, as well as individual elements, can be described on a series of polar relationships, and you can describe them between 1 to 5. Each force is assessed over its own polar values, then within itself. I'll come to the next diagram. It's important to note that not every relationship outlined in the following is going to apply to your project, but it's kind of, you can add or mix or match to them. But the general context is if you have an amorphous system and a familiar environment, it's sort of more a general context. The user experience would then the user experience can be more interpretive and more free. Whereas if you're in the other side of the spectrum, then the user experience would need to be a little bit more directed. So the relational context is the first force within a project. It's essentially the project brief, research question, and provocation. Here it's important to think through elements such as the authorship, the experience level, delivery of product, location, and narrative quality of the experience. So how specific is the product? So for example, on an e-commerce site would be considered something very specific, but art-based expressive site may have a more general audience in mind. So for more, the experience was to be a little bit more authored, with the artist being able to curate their work. So the next force is the system force, where one should consider rules, system feedback, app mechanics, invitation to interact, and interaction modalities. These relationships help determine if the system is more structured or amorphous. The more structured the system requirements, the less interpretive the user experience can be. So a medical training tool, for example, would be very structured, whereas a movie viewer would probably be less so. So more the user would have a guided experience up to a certain point, but then they would be encouraged to roam and explore. Interaction-wise, more is considered more multimodal because besides hand gestures, we're using the gaze to activate as well as physical movement. So the environment design is very closely related to the system design and often designed together. And so therefore you kind of think of them as very interrelated. The relationships within the environmental design are often determined with familiarity of the environment and kind of materiality and whether you're using props. So the more foreign the environment the user is placed in, the more directed the user experience needs to be. So an IKEA app would have an environment that users are immediately very familiar with, whereas a moon exploration experience would be pretty foreign. You'd probably have to explain almost everything. So more we tried to use some familiar cues to indicate activation zones. However, we wanted to be a lot more abstract with the desk, and so we had kind of floating objects, that were just below the user's eye line to cue that that's where they could go to get information. So the theory is that in most cases, assessing the system, environment, and context according to these values should allow the development of a reasonably complex user experience. In Rick and Morty, much of what you get to do is pretty foreign and ridiculous, but you learn through constant reinforcement, where they're kind of yelling at you instructions. And you have instruction cards lying around. We assessed our project to be something very specific in relational context, a structured system and a foreign environment, and therefore that the user experience needed to be a little bit more directed. User experience represents the intention of an app and therefore sets a tone for a user as to what they can expect. This involves the designing of the interface, interaction cues, how much information is exposed to the user, the simulation type, and the embodiedness of the app guide. And these relationships described are not an exhaustive list again, but are kind of meant to be used interchangeably with what you're developing. Because our design requirements are very much coupled with the development process, this helped guide a lot of the back and forth. So take that desk, for example, is kind of what I described down there. We tested many different iterations, and I'm still kind of working on that. So, and we don't have an embodied guide, which, it's kind of like a person that pops up that tells you what to do, so we use a lot of voice cues and prompts and text. So I think my gifts are flipped around. So this is kind of like the information guide to how you solve some puzzles. And the one before, this is actually the combiner tool, which you put two objects together and it turns into a different object, and you use that to solve puzzles. And you kind of, they introduce that in their mobile app, and they reinforce it again with a lot of instructions in their VR app. You can find the design assessment tool on my website, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, tweet at me on Google. I'm kind of always connected and on the web. Thank you so much.